Ukrainian Marines are maintaining a bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnipro River, engaged in fierce fighting with Russian troops pushing to retake parts of the country after Russia's invasion almost 2 years ago. But the front line has barely moved in a year, and a top general in Ukraine has described the war as a stalemate. The man behind the invasion, Russian President Vladimir Putin, drew attention this week, suggesting Russia was open to peace talks. Russian President Vladimir Putin addressing G20 leaders for the first time since the start of the war. He says it's time to think about how to end, quote, the tragedy of the war, telling the virtual summit, yes, of course, military actions are always a tragedy, and of course, we should think about how to stop this tragedy. By the way, Russia has never refused peace talks with Ukraine. Putin's latest comments are in stark contrast to his usual statements on the war, which have focused on the failings of the U.S. Of note, he used the word war instead of using his usual descriptor, a special military operation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed to fight until the last Russian soldier has left Ukraine's territory. Despite harsh winter conditions in the eastern Kharkiv region, clashes between Ukrainian and Russian troops have intensified. This soldier says, "We are holding the defensive line. We have strong soldiers. We do not have a more important task. We are fighting for every centimeter of land of our country." But the entire front line in the east and south hasn't moved much in a year. These troops dug into snow-covered trenches. One place where there is some movement is in the southern Kherson region, where Ukrainian forces have used boats to cross the Dnipro River and say they've taken up positions on the eastern bank. It was 1 year ago when the Russian military withdrew across the river, using it as a natural barrier to defend against Ukrainian attacks. According to Ukrainian armed forces, they've pushed back the Russians 3 to 8 kilometers from the riverfront, making it difficult for the enemy to fire mortars at positions on the right bank. However, Russian drones, artillery, and aerial-guided bombs are still landing, and constantly. The push across the river is very important for Ukraine. It wants to open the road to Russian-occupied Crimea and to protect the nearby city of Kherson. Despite the Russians withdrawing from the city last year, in the last month, attacks on Kherson have intensified. And for Ukraine to keep up its fight, constant Western support and supply of military aid is required.
The message that I bring you today, Mr. President, is that the United States of America is with you.
Earlier this week, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin made a surprise visit to Kyiv to reaffirm American support. The U.S. announcing another $100 million in weapons and military equipment. Western leaders, including Canada's Prime Minister, have said they will continue to support Kyiv, but questions have been raised about how much and for how long, as many of those nations are now also providing support for Israel's war against Hamas and the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Meantime, Zelensky and his wife led their nation in the celebration of a national holiday Tuesday, honoring the Maidan Revolution of 2014 and the Orange Revolution of 2004. 2 major events on Ukraine's march away from Russian influence and towards joining the European Union. For more, let's bring in Jane Boulden. She's a fellow at the Center for International Defense Policy at Queen's University and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. Jane, why do you think Putin is calling Ukraine a tragedy and comparing it to what is happening in Gaza?
Well, one of the things that the war in Gaza offers Putin is an opportunity to continue to claim that the West is living with a double standard, or engaging in double standards when it criticizes Russia on the one hand and doesn't criticize Israel for what it's doing in Gaza. They are obviously quite different situations, but for Putin, this is an opportunity to put the West in a bad light and also to push a little on the possibility that there are disagreements among the collective West, NATO plus countries, about what's happening in Gaza. And so it gives him two advantages in that respect.
Now, what about Putin's comment that Russia has never refused peace talks in Ukraine? Is he opening the door for a negotiated end?
Well, he's said this kind of thing before. He or his foreign minister Lavrov have always kind of said, "Yeah, we're open to negotiation, we're open to talks." The problem is that from a Ukrainian perspective, this is an all or nothing situation. It costs Putin nothing to say, we're open to talks, we're open to negotiations, because what is it you'd be negotiating? From the Russian perspective, they were going to be negotiating from a position of strength and looking at the land they already occupy and thinking, we might give on the edges, but overall we'd come out okay. But Putin knows that for Ukraine, even the idea of entering into negotiations is to imply they're willing to give something up, and that Russia in effect wins, and that violence pays. And so it's easy for him to make that offer because he's pretty certain Ukraine isn't going to take him up on it, and that in not taking up the offer of negotiations, it actually makes Ukraine and Ukraine's supporters look worse, because how could you not engage in peace negotiations? But the bottom line is Ukraine is in a very tough situation here, because for them, the optimal solution is for Russia's complete withdrawal from its sovereign territory. And as long as Russia occupies some of that territory, any negotiations are going to imply that that outcome is not achievable. It would be the equivalent of Russia invading the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, and then saying, let's negotiate, right? They're already going to have a chunk of the land under their control. Their idea of a negotiated outcome is not one in which they cede the land they've taken and give it all back to us. And that's the situation Ukraine is in.
The war in Gaza has taken the world's attention. Does that threaten Western support for Ukraine?
Indirectly, I think it does, unfortunately. The problem is not on the political side in terms of support. The problem is resources and attention and finances. And the Ukraine really needs an ongoing, significant amount of support from other countries in order to just keep going, let alone make a new push to possibly gain back some land. On the other hand, though, we now are in a situation where Israel is calling on and getting a lot of support from those same countries. And so for many of those countries, it's going to be an either-or situation. And the extent of civilian casualties and the nature of what's happening in Gaza mean that in terms of a news cycle, that's what's getting attention. And by extension, that's what's getting attention in political capitals in terms of where resources are going to be allocated. So in that sense, it is bad news for Ukraine. Part of the question is how long that will be the case.
That's Jane Boulden from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Jane, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.